I wrecked my tank. First off, no you didn't. I know bubble algae is a bit of a pain in the butt, and to top it off, there's been a common myth floating around the hobby for ages, but there are quite a few really effective ways of dealing with a bubble algae outbreak. But before we get into all that, what exactly is bubble algae? Bubble algae, aka Valonia ventricosa, is a large unicellular algae. That's right, it might be macro in size, but it is in fact unicellular. It's actually the largest unicellular organism on Earth. It can range in size from tiny little dots up to spheres that are over an inch in diameter. The large grape-like thallus of bubble algae are held onto the rocks and other surfaces by rhizoids. While it tends to grow relatively slowly, it can easily take over surfaces over time and reproduces by segregative cell division, where the rhizoids form new bubbles which become separate from the parent cell. And this is where that common myth comes into play. While it appears that Valonia can also reproduce sexually, scientists still haven't quite pinned down how that happens. However, what we do know is that popping bubble algae does not release spores into the water column. While there are many different organelles within the cell, no spores are present. So while popping bubble algae might not help you get rid of it, it also shouldn't cause it to start appearing all over the aquarium. Knocking a bubble or two away and it floating to a different spot in the tank where it can settle down and begin reproducing through division is most likely how it spreads around our aquariums. While bubble algae doesn't tend to cause much harm to anything in the tank, it does grow on surfaces in and around corals, which can potentially irritate them and, more importantly, stifles the corals, preventing them from being able to grow onto the rock where the bubble algae is now growing. Which is why it can be important to make sure that bubble algae doesn't get out of control. So how did you get bubble algae into your aquarium in the first place? While I hate to break it to you, it is incredibly easy to add bubble algae to your aquarium by accident. And yes, you did hear me right. You added it to your aquarium, again, most likely by accident, unless you did it on purpose. But before we talk about how to get rid of the bubble algae that you've got, let's talk about how you can prevent putting it into your aquarium in the first place. So where does bubble algae come from? It comes from another system that already has bubble algae. So that means live rock from your local fish store or from another hobbyist, live sand transferred from another system, water from another system can have bubbles floating in it, and most commonly, you can easily get it on coral bases or skeletons, as well as frag plugs or discs, which is most likely how the vast majority of reefers are getting bubble algae into their tanks. I'm willing to bet that at least one of those things sounded pretty familiar to you, but don't sweat it. Once you know how you're most likely getting that bubble algae into your system, you can then take preventative measures to make sure you don't do that particular thing anymore. If your reef is newly set up with live rock or live sand, you can keep the lights off while cycling the tank to prevent unwanted algae from growing while there could be excess nutrients in the system. When adding new corals, you could remove those corals from their plugs or bases onto new ones that are algae-free. If you can't remove them, you can physically remove the bubble algae as best as possible and then dip the bases into or brush on some hydrogen peroxide and let it sit for a few minutes, which will help make sure the bubble algae is killed off, along with any other nasty algae that might be present. You can also make sure to add a good cleanup crew of herbivorous inverts to your reef before you start adding corals, or now if you haven't already. Just don't overdo it, because too many snails and urchins is a recipe for disaster. The algae may go away faster, or perhaps not even show up at all, but those critters will starve and die, meaning nutrients increase, meaning fuel for algae. So just a few to start. Speaking of snails, their shells can actually have bubble algae and other algae on them. Even if you can't see it, the beginnings of algae could be there, and a careful scrub with hydrogen peroxide is a good way to clean them up. Just make sure none of it goes inside the snail's opening or onto its body. Adding utilitarian fish, specifically herbivores like rabbitfish and tangs, can also help prevent algae from getting out of control. Bolstering the microbiome and adding microcrustaceans right away, like copepods and amphipods, is a great tactic. Microorganisms can cover the rock and help compete for space against unwanted algae like bubble algae, and those microcrustaceans can graze on the early stages of bubble algae while they're still soft and before they turn into that big firm bubble. But even if you try your hardest to keep it out and bubble algae still manages to get into your aquarium, the most important thing is that you don't wait to begin treating the first signs. When you see bubble algae, you should take action immediately. While it doesn't seem to grow super quickly, if left unchecked, you might find that it begins to take over and becomes a bigger and more difficult issue to deal with. So let's talk about how you can deal with a bubble algae outbreak. There are essentially 4 ways to approach treating bubble algae: natural predators, physical removal, filtration and nutrient control, and chemical treatments. So, what are your options for natural predators? Mithrax crabs, particularly emerald crabs, are one of the staple predators when it comes to bubble algae control. They have been well documented for many years as consumers of bubble algae, and I, along with many other reefers, have had success using emerald crabs. That isn't to say they always get the job done. Sometimes it takes a while before they decide to start picking away at bubble algae, and I assume this delay is usually a case of them just having a more preferable algae to graze on at first. But you can easily tell when an emerald crab has been hard at work. You can see it in this reef, where the only spots bubble algae is still growing is on the pumps and surfaces that the crab can't reach. Everywhere else has been picked clean. Emerald crabs also stay small and they can be kept in nanotanks, making them the best bubble algae predator for reefers with smaller aquariums. They are super easy to care for, they aren't terribly picky eaters, and they get along peacefully with their tank mates. Another great option are foxface rabbitfish. These beautiful fish are well known for their love of bubble algae. Just having one of these fish in your reef can prevent bubble algae from ever noticeably spreading. But if you've already got a bubble algae infestation, a foxface rabbitfish is more than capable of combating it on its own. The only caveat is that these fish get fairly large, topping out at around 8 inches, making them suitable for aquariums no smaller than 70 gallons. They are peaceful towards their tank mates, but they can be quite territorial with other rabbitfish, and they have venomous dorsal spines, so extra care when handling them if you don't want a very painful sting. Lastly, for those with XXL tanks, Flamingi tanks have been one of my all-time favorite algae eating machines. They will demolish all kinds of algae, bubble algae included, and they are gentle giants with their tank mates. The only real downside is that they get massive. We're talking 2 feet long. That being said, they often come into the hobby as very small babies, usually only a few inches in length. So you could add one to a smaller aquarium to start off, but just be well aware that they're going to need a ton of space in the long run. While there have been rumblings of some species of urchin potentially grazing on bubble algae, they're probably not the best option. I, for example, have a tuxedo urchin that does wonders for turf algae and other filamentous algae, but has not touched bubble algae other than to wear it as a hat. Not super helpful. That being said, adding Halloween or tuxedo urchins definitely won't hurt, and if anything, they will help keep many other algae at bay. And natural predators are a great step towards solving a bubble algae issue. But you can also play the role of a predator by helping to remove that bubble algae yourself. First off, yes, you absolutely can carefully remove as much of the bubble algae as possible by hand, preferably in intact clumps, and chuck it away. The reason just popping it is likely not very effective and leads to more bubble algae is because the rhizoid will be left behind, which is where new bubbles can sprout from, whereas gently pulling them off the rocks intact will also help remove as much of the rhizoid as possible. If the bubble algae is tucked in a crevice, which is often the case, and you can't easily get it out with your fingers, you can use tools like tweezers or the epoxy removal pick from your fragging kit to help lift them out of that crevice. I usually prefer to do this while siphoning out water to make sure they don't float free so that they don't get blown around the tank and end up out of reach where they might start another patch of bubble algae. Alternatively, you can also use a fishnet to help remove any free-floating bubbles from the water column before they settle somewhere that they shouldn't. Any of the pumps or equipment in the aquarium that are growing bubble algae can just be removed and thoroughly cleaned, whether that's with a citric acid bath or good old-fashioned elbow grease. While I hate to say it, your display might not be the only place that bubble algae has taken over. It is very common for them to also end up all over your refugium or even inside your algae turf scrubber. Basically everywhere that there's water and light. The good news is that it is really easy to deal with them there. You can dispose of the macroalgae in your refugium and replace it with clean macroalgae. While the fuge is empty, you can physically remove the bubble algae and then spray it down with hydrogen peroxide, let it sit for 15 minutes or so, and then rinse it out. Same goes for an algae turf scrubber. Now what about filtration and nutrient control? Algae in general tends to grow best in nutrient-rich environments, which means making sure your nutrients, namely nitrate and phosphate, aren't skyrocketing out of control is going to be an important step in getting ahead of any algae issue. Phosphate between 0.02 and 0.06 and nitrate between 5 and 10 ppm will be a reasonable range to aim for. It keeps enough nutrients in the system for your corals, but without it being so high that algae can really take advantage. If your nutrients are too high, you can do water changes to bring them down, or if you find them constantly coming back up even after water changes, you can improve your filtration by adding a refugium, an algae turf scrubber, or a macroalgae reactor that will help take up those excess nutrients. Fleece rollers are also a fantastic form of filtration for removing waste, including uneaten foods that go down the overflow before it ever gets a chance to break down into nitrate and phosphate in the water, which is an easy and reliable way to control nutrients mechanically. Now, there is a last resort chemical treatment that you can use if you have an absolutely outrageous bubble algae issue that you just cannot seem to get the best of, even after you've tried all the things we've talked about so far. But the important thing to keep in mind is, even if you decide to go this route, you still want to make sure that you remove as much of the bubble algae by hand as possible to make sure that you don't end up with a nutrient spike from all that algae dying off. The chemical that I'm talking about is the active ingredient in Algae Fix by API. When used as directed, over the course of several weeks, it will cause the bubble algae to turn from green to a silverish gray color before melting away. While it is listed as safe for fish and corals and invertebrates, it will work to remove many types of algae, including macroalgae species, and in some cases it can irritate corals and invertebrates, especially if you exceed the recommended dose, which is why I generally keep this option as a last resort, especially since the other methods that I've covered will most often get the job done. Now, I know that was a lot of information, but if you follow it and keep up with it, even if it doesn't happen right away, you will be able to get ahead of this bombardment of bubble algae. And once you do, you're gonna feel like $1,000,000 and your tank will thank you for it. Just make sure to follow those preventative measures that I talked about at the beginning to make sure that it never comes back again. And bubble algae likely won't be the only pest that you face on your reefing journey. So if you'd also like help with all of those other pests and learn how to deal with them effectively or prevent them entirely, you can check out the other videos just like this one in this playlist right here.